Hello. So it looks like it's 6 o'clock. We'll go ahead and get started. My name is Beth Reynolds. I am the program specialist for the Iowa Beef Center, and we want to welcome you to the fourth and final webinar in our Winter What Cow webinar series. If you haven't been able to join us for the last three webinars, that's okay. They are posted online and recorded. But hopefully you'll find some useful tools in today's webinar. It'll focus on pasture management. First, we'll hear from Rebecca Vittetoe. She is the East Central Iowa field agronomist. Jeff Matthias, our NRCS Grasslands specialist, will talk about some CRP grazing and changes that have been made in that program. And then finally, Dr. Adam Janke, our Extension Wildlife Specialist, will talk about some of the interactions wildlife have while grazing and how to be better managers of that. We'll let Rebecca get started, and thank you for joining.
So my name is Rebecca Vittetoe, and I am one of the ISU Extension field agronomists. And as Beth mentioned, I am the field agronomist in East Central Iowa. And I will be covering spring forage management. So just to give you an overview of the area that I cover here in the state of Iowa. I cover this kind of Region 8 area on the map right there. So I'm housed in the Washington County Extension Office, and I cover 10 counties in East Central Iowa. My contact information is on the screen, so if you have any questions after tonight's session, feel free to reach out. I also have the link to the other field agronomists on the screen as well, so feel free to reach out to your local extension field agronomist. We're more than happy to help answer any questions you might have. So the topics that I'll be covering for spring forage management are frost seeding and interseeding forages into existing stands. I'm talking about evaluating stands for winter kill, and then spring weed management and spring forage fertility as well. So I'm going to start off first with frost seeding. We're probably, especially in the southern part of the state, towards the end of this window of when we would typically be doing frost seeding. For those in the northern part of the state, there still might be the opportunity to do some frost seeding. But in general, with frost seeding, what we're doing is we're just going to be broadcasting a legume or potentially a grass seed, but I really emphasize probably more on the legume side, on an existing grass, pasture, or hayfield. In late winter or early spring while that ground is still frozen. So our recommendation with frost seeding is that we want it on the bare ground, not on top of snow cover. So that's one misconception people have sometimes, is that it's okay to do it on top of snow cover. We prefer it on bare ground. It's okay if it snows on top of it afterwards, but ideally want it on that bare ground, not on top of snow cover. And then with frost seeding, the idea is that freeze-thaw cycle is going to, and the early spring rains will help to get good seed to soil contact with what we're frost seeding, and that will help it to get going there. So it's a relatively inexpensive way to add some additional forage species to an existing pasture or hayfield. So I mentioned that with frost seeding, we're probably going to focus more on the legume side compared to our grasses, and I'll talk about that here in a second. But why might you consider adding a legume to your pasture or to your hayfield? For one, it can help to improve the forage quality. So it'll be a nice complement to what's there already with the grasses, but it can help improve the forage quality. Especially for people in the southern part of the state that deal more with fescue toxicosis or might have the potential for seeing fescue toxicosis, having that legume in the pasture can help to, we tend to see fewer problems with that. It can also help to improve animal gains, as well as reduce our need for adding additional nitrogen fertilizer. So if we have about 1/3 of that pasture or hayfield that has a legume with it, we typically don't need to add any more nitrogen. So it can help to reduce some potential inputs. And then it can also help extend the grazing season, especially during that summer slump. when some of the cool season grasses aren't going to be growing as much. So those are some reasons why we might consider adding a legume. There are many benefits that adding a legume to a pasture or hayfield can provide, but there are also some other things to consider as well. So if we're adding a legume, they typically have higher fertility requirements compared to just if we have straight grass. So we typically, from a pH perspective, if we have grass, clover, or like a bird's foot trefoil, the pH we recommend is to have around 6.0. However, if we have alfalfa or alfalfa grass mixtures, we recommend a higher pH. The alfalfa does much better with a higher pH. So to raise that soil pH, if we need to raise it, we do suggest incorporating lime or applying that lime 6 months to a year prior to planting. So that would have been something I would have encouraged people to do last fall. And then if there's any soil testing and if there's any additional needs for phosphorus or potassium, applying that before seeding would be a good idea as well. Legumes can be more susceptible to some diseases and insects. So like especially with alfalfa, one of the insect pests we tend to see here in Iowa is like potato leafhopper. So those can be more susceptible to things like that. Legumes also typically do not last as long as perennial grasses do. So it's kind of one of those maintenance things that we might need to continually add more periodically. And then if we have persistent perennial weeds, especially like Canada thistle or things like that, they can be more difficult to manage if we have a mixed pasture with grass and legumes. So we'd want to take care of any potential weed issues that we have first. So from a species selection, as far as what works best for frost seeding, the species that I tend to recommend is red clover. Red clover is usually going to be the most successful forage species when it comes to frost seeding. We can typically expect red clover to last about 2 growing seasons, and it can spread as volunteer plants if we do let it go to seed. There's some other legumes that could also be potentially frost seeded. So some other clovers as well as bird's foot trefoil. Bird's foot trefoil does have a little bit poorer seedling vigor, and it can be slower to establish. So that one might not be as easy to get established. Same thing with alfalfa. So the easiest one to get established from a frost seeding perspective is going to be the red clover. Grasses are usually going to be less successful if we try to frost seed them in, just because those seeds tend to be bigger and it's hard to get that seed to soil contact that we need. So we typically don't recommend frost seeding with grasses, more so with legumes, specifically red clover. If from a seeding rate perspective, and this comes from an ISU extension publication, PM 856, and these are just suggested seeding rates for frost seeding. There's rates for just frost seeding species specifically by themselves, as well as if we're going to frost seed them in mixtures. So you can find the PM 856 publication on the ISU extension store and download that for free. So that's a good resource that we have for more information on seeding rates there. From a seeding rate perspective, there's kind of a low rate and a high rate. We tend to maybe lean a little bit more towards maybe that high rate to help with the success of that frost seeding. One thing, especially if we're going to be frost seeding a legume, we do recommend or encourage seed inoculation, especially if that pasture has not had a legume or that specific legume in it for a while. So those legumes, in order to fix nitrogen, they have to form a symbiotic relationship with a bacteria. And so if we inoculate with the bacteria, that helps to get that nodulation going. When it comes to seed inoculation to help with the nodulation, we just recommend not making sure that it's not expired. And if for some reason you have seed that you want to carry over and potentially use the following year, just store that seed and that inoculum in a cool place, especially over the summer, to help make sure that it stores better. And there's a nice picture there on the screen that shows the difference between a legume that was not inoculated and one that was inoculated. So that can really help make a difference in getting that nodulation going and that nitrogen fixation going. So these are just some steps to follow as far as like a recipe for success with frost seeding. And these come out of the ISU extension publication PM 856. So first we want to make sure that we have a suitable site. So sites that would be good contenders for potentially frost seeding would be if we have an area that has a thinner grass stand, or maybe it's bare, an area that doesn't have much growing there. I usually don't recommend grazing too closely, but if we're going to be frost seeding, we do want to graze a little bit closer the fall before to help reduce that grass competition and aid in the establishment as those new seedlings are getting established. Weed control is also really important when it comes to frost seeding. So ideally, if we're going to be frost seeding now, yet this would already be done. And it's really important to make sure that we do control broadleaf weeds before we introduce legumes into the pasture. So if we've got whether it's bull thistle, musk thistle, Canada thistle, multiflora rose, or whatever the weed might be, we want to make sure that those are under control first before we introduce a legume into that pasture. From a soil fertility perspective, we encourage to take a soil test so that way we know what the soil can actually provide. And if we do need to apply any additional potassium or phosphorus, we can do that based off of what the soil test results come back, as well as seeing what that pH is and if we need to add any lime. We do recommend minimizing nitrogen application the year before seeding. So we want to make sure that we're not stimulating that grass or potential weeds, making it harder for those new seedlings to compete. So we can minimize that. That can help give those new seedlings a better chance to get off the start. So from a frost seeding perspective, we typically recommend doing that either in late February or early March. And we would ideally want that, as I mentioned, on frozen ground. We want to avoid seeding on snow cover because if we get a fast melt with that snow cover, it could potentially wash those seeds away. So it's okay if it snows on top, but ideally we'd want it on top of just frozen ground. After we frost seed, some steps or recommendations we'd have for managing grazing after seeding is we want to control or minimize grass and weed competition, and we want to try and avoid close or continuous grazing with that as well, and then make sure we do maintain soil fertility, and that's especially important if we're going to be harvesting anything for hay. From a pasture perspective, I don't worry about that as much, especially if we're going to be harvesting for hay and taking that forage off. Making sure that we put back on what we take off is really important. And these are just some additional references that are really good for frost seeding. So I mentioned the ISU extension publication PM 856. That one is Improving Pasture by Frost Seeding. So that has a lot of really good information about frost seeding. There's also a publication on selecting forage species, as well as some other resources on frost seeding or talking about how pasture plants grow. And then we also have our pasture management guide as well. So really good resources if you want additional information on frost seeding. So frost seeding is one of the ways that we could introduce some additional forage into a pasture or hayfield. For some people, another option would be interseeding. So with interseeding, that we're going to introduce a legume or a grass into an existing stand with a no-till drill. So this is going to be most effective in thin stands. So if there were places that were maybe overgrazed or maybe feeding areas this winter or things like that are a little bit thinner, those might be good contenders potentially for interseeding some forages. So typically the time frame that we look for interseeding forages into an existing stand would be mid-March through early May. If we get later into May, we worry about them getting established enough. So usually that mid-March through early May is the window that we're looking at for interseeding. This, from an interseeding perspective, it requires relatively few field operations, so it's still something fairly simple to do. So a lot of what we would do from a frost seeding perspective is going to be very similar to what we would do from an interseeding perspective as well. So soil sampling prior to interseeding is also important, just like we talked about with frost seeding. And then just lime and fertilize based off of those soil test results. We would also recommend grazing or clipping closely before seeding, so that can help with those seedings, making the seeding easier, and it can also help to reduce competition for those seedlings as they're getting established. And just like we talked about with frost seeding, weed management is also important. So we have persistent weeds, managing those ahead of time before we interseed, especially if we're going to interseed a legume, is really important. So as far as different types of species for interseeding, there's lots of different options. So maybe just interseeding a single legume or a legume mixture or a grass legume mixture or just a grass. So different options there depending upon kind of what your goals are. One thing from a more of an agronomic perspective is trying to match that legume with the grass. So I'm thinking about how that legume grows and what type of grass species it might grow best with. So for example, birdfoot trefoil tends to do better with Kentucky bluegrass or orchard grass, and alfalfa or red clover tend to do better with brome grass, tall fescue, or reed canary grass. So thinking about maybe what grasses we have out there might help us think about what legume we might want to interseed as well. This is our suggested seeding rates for interseeding. So this comes from the ISU extension publication PM 1097. And just like the publication I talked about for frost seeding, this one can also be downloaded for free from the ISU extension store. So this just talks about how many pounds per acre of the different seed we would suggest seeding or interseeding to get what we want back out there. So a nice reference, and we've got different recommendations depending upon what you're thinking you might want to add. Just like we talked about with the frost seeding, if we're going to add a legume, we do recommend seed inoculation. Same thing with interseeding. If we're going to add a legume, we recommend making sure that that seed is inoculated. And so that's just a reminder what we've already talked about there. When it comes to interseeding with the no-till drill, probably the thing that I run into the most is the seeding depth of that drill. So we want to plant most of our small seeded grasses and legumes at about 1/4 of an inch below the soil surface, never deeper than 3/4 of an inch. So I more so run into issues where people are planting it too deep. So that's something to keep a really close eye on, is the depth of that drill. Depending upon the type of drill that you might be using, the depth control may not be the best. So making sure that you've got that set right and stopping while you're seeding to check that depth control can be really important. I will say that seeds planted too shallow have a better chance of getting established than those if they're planted too deeply. And with that 1/4 of an inch below the soil surface, it's not very deep. So if you're looking behind the drill to see how things are going, you will see some seed on top of the soil surface, approximately 8 to 10 seeds per square foot. So don't be alarmed if you do see some seed on the soil surface. That's okay. That's normal if we're seeding it at that 1 inch below the soil surface. So just pay attention to that seeding depth, because that can really have a big impact on how well that new seeding might get established. As far as managing that new seeding, once we do get it seeded, shortly about 10 to 14 days after we plant that, I would expect to start to see those new seedlings growing. So that might be a little bit weather dependent, but I would expect to see them about 2 to 3 weeks after we plant to see those growing. So go out and check. We don't see necessarily a lot of insect issues with new seedings, but it never hurts to check for any potential insect feeding, and potentially treat if needed. Before we start grazing, I ideally would like to see about 3 to 5 inches on those new seedlings. You could also do a little bit of what we call the pluck test. So go down as if you're the cow trying to eat that grass and try and pull it out of the ground. If you're going to pull the roots out with it, it's probably not ready to be grazed. And especially if you're a horse person, making sure that we're being patient too, and really avoid close grazing because we want to help those seedlings get off to a really good start there. So rotating and fencing things off can be really important as those new seedlings are getting established, even if it's just temporary fencing that can kind of help to give those new seedlings a chance to get started before we graze them. Towards the end of the season, we do want to give those new seedlings a rest before we go into the winter. So September 1st or Labor Day, we would suggest to wait 4 to 6 weeks or give it a 4 to 6 week rest period in the fall. If you do need some forage, if you're short on forage, you could potentially graze later, so maybe after October 15th. If you do that, I would suggest leaving 3 inches of residual forage going into the winter. So we do want to leave some forage height there going into the winter to help it get started. So pay attention on that grazing height there. And these are just some additional references for interseeding. So I talked about the ISU Extension publication PM 1097. Interseeding and no-till pasture renovation. So that one has a lot of good information in that one. And then there's, as I mentioned before, too, the references Iowa State has on selecting forage species, how pasture plants grow, and then also our pasture management guide, which also has really good information in it. So that's what I had as far as adding a new forage species into an existing stand. Another important thing to do in the spring is evaluate fields for winter injury. And this is especially important in alfalfa fields. Last spring, we did see quite a bit of winter kill with alfalfa. So getting out there and scouting and evaluating those fields for winter injury is really important. So we typically see winter injury or winter kill if we don't see a lot of snow cover and the crown temperatures of those alfalfa plants get less than 0 degrees Fahrenheit. We can also see winter injury or winter kill if we get a warm spell midwinter, so that those alfalfa plants might start to think that it's spring and they want to break dormancy, but we're not quite ready for them to do that yet. So those warm spells midwinter can cause some winter injury or winter kill. And the other area where we tend to see more winter injury or winter kill is if plants are submerged in frozen or ponded water in low-lying areas. That if they've got that ice cover on top of them, they're not able to breathe, and that can suffocate them and cause them to have some winter injury or winter kill as well. With evaluating fields for winter injury, our winter injured plants may survive. It depends upon the extent of that injury, but they can be slow to recover. So we don't want to make hasty decisions. We do want to give it some time, and also making sure that we're spending some time evaluating those fields. So one thing that we can do is consider how many plants per square foot we have and the age of the stand, and based off of that, we can make decisions. And we would typically recommend going out and doing those types of stand counts when we have that spring regrowth to about 3 to 4 inches high. That's a good time to go out. So for scouting fields for winter injury, I suggested or talked about doing stand counts. If we're going to do stand counts, we would suggest doing stand counts at random sites. And I would suggest doing about 1 stand count for every 5 to 10 acres. So depending upon the size of your field, you can then determine approximately how many stand counts you would do. And what we would do when we do those stand counts is I have a 1 foot by 1 foot square that I use, And I throw that out there so it's random, so you're not just selecting the best site or necessarily the worst site. And we can look at all those plants in that 1 foot square area. So I want to look and see, am I seeing new growth on those plants there? Check the crown and the buds to make sure that those plants are still alive, and then count how many live plants we actually see per square foot. And the table that I've got here on the screen shows, based off of the stand age of our alfalfa, how many plants per square foot we would expect to have. If we're less than that, that's when we would recommend maybe either potentially interseeding something in there if you don't want to tear it up, or maybe starting a new field all over. So you can see, as that stand gets older, the plants per square foot will eventually decrease. But you can see this is a nice table to use to determine, do we potentially need to do something. And we've got the recommendation, if it's pure alfalfa, how many alfalfa plants we would suggest per square foot, as well as if we had alfalfa in an alfalfa grass mix, how many alfalfa plants we would want per square foot. When we've got that square foot out there and we're evaluating how many plants we have in a 1 foot square there, one thing I like to look for, and it's in the first picture with the 1 on it, is evaluating, okay, how symmetrical are those plants greening up? Is just half of that plant greening up? Is the whole plant greening up? That can be an indicator of potential winter injury that we're seeing. I also like to dig up some plants and cut them open to check to see if we see any type of rot. So the picture on the top that says courtesy of Brian Lang up there, that is a healthy alfalfa plant. So that's what I want to see when I'm scouting and looking at those alfalfa plants in the spring. So we want nice white tissue. I want that tissue to be not soft, so nice and hard. So that's what I would like to see. The picture on the bottom shows a plant that has some injury to it. So we've got some discoloration there. And it can survive, but it's not going to be as productive, and it might not survive for the next growing season. So seeing how much of that we see out in the field is also important to take into consideration. Most of our forage grasses are typically going to survive better than our legumes. Orchard grass and ryegrass can be more susceptible to winter injury. And so looking at that crown tissue and checking for regrowth can help us to evaluate if we're seeing much winter injury, particularly with those species. So managing for winter injury, these are just some recommendations that we would suggest if we do see some winter injury out there in the field. So if you do have winter injury and you're planning on still harvesting, you're not going to do anything with that field, we would suggest allowing those plants to mature to about 10 to 25% bloom or later, so waiting a little bit before cutting, and then also increasing the cutting height to about 3 to 4 inches. And then making sure that we have good soil fertility, so making sure that we're putting back on what we take off, and then making sure that we're scouting, especially for insects like potato leafhopper, because those plants are already going to be stressed. And if we stress them out more, that can really hurt the productivity. If we do have severely injured stands, we would plan to reestablish or reseed. We do not recommend to reseed alfalfa into more than a 2+ year stand, so we'd be starting a new field of alfalfa. Another option, if you're not ready to start a new field of alfalfa, or if you are, but you need some additional forage yet this year, we can do some overseeding or drilling red clover grasses into our existing stand can help to fill that in. We just recommend doing that by the end of April. And then depending upon how injured it is, you may need to plan for some supplemental forage as well. And then there's some nice references for evaluating stands for winter injury. So the top one there is from Wisconsin, but they have a nice one on alfalfa stand assessment. Is it a good stand, or is it a good enough stand to keep? And then the ISU publication PM 1362, evaluating hay and pasture stands for winter injury, is also a really nice resource for evaluating evaluating winter injury. So we talked about frost seeding and interseeding, and then also evaluating for winter injury. Another topic that comes up in the spring regarding pasture management is I start to get more questions about weed management. So when it comes to managing our weeds, spring can be an effective time to scout and control, particularly winter annual weeds and biannual weeds in our pastures. So if we need to spray a herbicide because we were dealing with those weeds in our pastures, we recommend spraying before those weeds bolt. So before they put that stalk on to put the seed head on. There's different herbicide options out there. The majority of what we're going to use in our pastures tend to be more of our growth regulator or group 4 herbicide. So there's different products out there, or metsulfuron, which would be a group 2 herbicide. So different options out there. We just always encourage to make sure that you do read and follow the herbicide labels, and particularly look and see if there's any grazing restrictions or crop rotation restrictions, or maybe what you do with where you move the cattle or livestock after they're grazing on pastures potentially treated with some of those herbicides. So just read and follow those herbicide labels. One thing to consider, do you need to broadcast spray or can you spot spray? And that can depend upon your weed pressure. So if you just have a spot where you're dealing with the weeds, spot spraying could be very effective instead of spraying it across the entire pasture. So taking into account the weed pressure that you have. For perennial weeds like Canada thistle or woody perennial weeds such as multiflora rose, spring is not going to be the best time to control those weeds. So we would suggest waiting and treating those plants until they're at the bud to bloom stage, or probably a better time for controlling those would be even doing a herbicide application in the fall, because those plants will take that herbicide down to their roots, and we tend to get a more effective kill on those. The other thing I would say, if we're going to be spraying with herbicides in the spring, would be to consider the environmental conditions. So I ideally would suggest spraying on a sunny day, and if we have temperatures that are in the 50s, if we spray on a cloudy day or if it's really cool out, those herbicides might not be taken up as well, and we might not get as good of a kill. So thinking about those environmental conditions as well. Spraying isn't our only option for weed control. Mowing can also be an effective way for weed control. But just like with herbicides, the timing of when we mow can be really important on how effective that strategy is at controlling weeds. So for winter annual or biannual weeds, we would suggest target mowing after those weeds bolt, but before they set seed. So I want to do it before they've got the seed out there, because I don't want to spread that seed with the mower out there. And with mowing, just be aware that it might require multiple times to mow to help prevent seed production on those plants. And when it comes to weed management, it's really important to think about why you're seeing those weeds out there. So, if we have overgrazed pastures, or maybe we haven't been properly fertilizing those pastures or hayfields, and those stands aren't as vigorous, that can provide a lot of opportunity for weeds to grow. So if we can maintain a vigorous forage stand and not overgraze, and make sure that we have proper fertility out there, that can be really important in trying to manage weeds in our pastures or hayfields as well. The last thing that I wanted to talk about here tonight is fertilizing pasture and hayfields. This one I do get questions on, and so our requirements or our thought process is a little bit different than row cropping, but it is still important to make sure that we are soil testing and putting on, especially we're harvesting for hay, the nutrients that we take back off. So soil testing is going to be kind of figuring out that baseline of what's in the soil and if we need to potentially add anything additional. On the pasture side, as long as we're not haying any of that pasture, most of that's going to get returned back to the soil as those animals are grazing out there. So Approximately 75 to 95% of our phosphorus and potassium is getting returned to the soil, and we can also see some of that nitrogen return to the soil and the manure or urine as well. The one thing is to consider how evenly distributed are those nutrients in the pasture. So, if we've got areas where there's lots of animal congregation, you might see a little bit more manure in those spots. So thinking about the evenness of that. From a hayfield perspective, we really need to think about how much we're harvesting every year, because our forage crops do remove a lot of phosphate and potassium or potash when we're harvesting them. So the table I have up here, this is adapted from the ISU publication PM 1688, and I just focus specifically on some of the forage species that we might potentially harvest as hay. But for instance, if we harvest alfalfa or alfalfa grass, we would remove 13 pounds of P2O5 per ton and 43 pounds of K2O per ton. So, if we harvest, 3 or 4 or 5 tons, depending upon what we can get in a year, we can remove a lot of phosphate and potassium. So it's really important to figure out what we're taking off and making sure that we do put that back on. And you can see the numbers that we have for crop removal for trefoil or red clover with the grass, as well as for smooth brome grass, tall fescue, and reed canary. You can see that we do remove quite a bit of nutrients. So it is important to put back, and that can help with productivity as well. The other question I get is about nitrogen. So the soil test will tell us if we need to add lime or how much phosphorus or potassium. These are just some of our recommendations on fertilizing from a nitrogen perspective. So if we have a cool season grass, so these would be things like brome grass, orchard grass, tall fescue, Timothy, or Kentucky bluegrass. Applying nitrogen in the spring or also in the late summer or autumn. So if we're wanting some fall growth, we would typically recommend anywhere from 80 to 120 pounds of nitrogen per acre. If we've got fescue, we want to make sure or watch how much nitrogen that we're putting on. Warm season grasses, we would suggest planting that nitrogen a little bit later because they're not going to be growing as early in the spring, and we'd suggest anywhere from 80 to 100 pounds. And you could, with both the cool season or those warm season, apply that nitrogen as well. From a phosphorus and potassium perspective, we can apply that early spring or in the fall, especially if we have very low or low testing soils. And as I mentioned, we do want to be careful with our nitrogen rates if we have tall fescue, and we don't want to over fertilize with nitrogen because that can cause more issues with fescue toxicosis. If we have a legume grass pasture or hayfield, if we have less than a third of that stand being a legume, we may need some additional nitrogen, but it's not going to be, the rates we talked about on the previous slide if we just had a solid grass stand. If that stand that we have out there is more than a third of legume, we don't need to add any extra nitrogen. That legume is going to take care of it. And then from a phosphorus and potassium perspective, just like with the straight grass pastures or hayfields, we would suggest applying that fertilizer early spring or in the fall, particularly if we have low or very low testing soils. And these are just some good references for fertilizing pastures. So PM 869 talks about fertilizing pasture. That's a nice publication we have that you can download from the extension store. And then a really good one on soil fertility is our publication PM 1688, a general guide for crop nutrients and limestone recommendations in Iowa. So that one's got different tables based off of what the soil test levels come back as far as what we would suggest putting back on. So good references there. Just a summary as we wrap up here, and this is kind of looking a little bit as a calendar of when we might do things. So at February, early March timeframe, we would be thinking about frost seeding. March, April, we're talking about interseeding and doing some potential spring weed control, especially if we've got winter annual or biannual weeds. And then in April, we'd be looking more at scouting our fields for winter injury, particularly in our alfalfa fields. We'd be finishing interseeding forages, and then fertilizing pasture or hay fields, and also maybe finishing up some weed control too. So with that, if there's any questions, I'd be happy to answer them, or we can wait. I would say don't hesitate to reach out either to myself or to any of the extension field agronomists.
All right, thank you, Rebecca. So definitely a lot of good reminders there. Next up will be Jeff Matthias. He is the NRCS Grasslands Specialist. So with that, I will let Jeff go ahead and get started.
All righty, thank you for letting me come and do this presentation here tonight for you guys. Some of this information is really brand new, as in I just saw the policy on it yesterday, so you're going to be hearing some stuff pretty early in the game going on with this. I'm just going through some information on the CRP here. So I'm going to talk through, the main thing I'm going to talk about is grazing of the cropland CRP. That's what the majority of this is coming up with. There's two situations where we do that now. We call them the non-emergency and the emergency grazing and haying on both of those. Another thing I want to make everybody aware of is the CRP Grasslands sign-up is going to be starting soon. That is a program that pays people to maintain pastures in grass. It has some restrictions going with it, so you're going to want to look closely to see if it is something that's going to work for you. And the last subject I want to talk about is something we don't have hardly any of the rules done on yet, but it is called the Soil Health and Income Protection Program, nicknamed SHIP. That's a pilot with a sign-up that's going to be starting soon. And that is for seeding down some of our poorer producing croplands with 3 to 5 year contracts. So I'll get into these as I go through them all. So go ahead and starting off here with the haying and grazing. We received a new farm bill from Congress last year. And in that there were some rules that they wanted changed and they told us to do. So Congress goes and writes the law that puts that stuff in, then it goes through regulation, then it ended up coming down finally to being policy in it. So anyhow, with the new farm bill, there's definitely an expansion of opportunities to be able to go ahead and do haying and grazing on the ground. We're still going to have to be consistent with priorities of CRP as far as soil, water quality, and wildlife habitat. Again, we still have the primary nesting season and we have restrictions as far as what we can do during the actual primary nesting season. We have to make sure that we're not going to be detrimental to the health and vigor of the cover. We can't be putting too many cattle out there that we end up killing it. And if we are doing prescribed grazing, we have to have a site-specific plan developed with those, which we have been doing a lot of that, but with some of the new ones, we're going to be changing up a little bit on some of those options. So as I said earlier, FSA will administer 2 types of haying and grazing, the non-emergency haying and or grazing, and then the emergency haying and or grazing. I'll have it later in the slides too, but you can't do both of them on the same ground in the same year. I just see that now as I'm looking at this slide. So yeah, we can either do non-emergency haying or non-emergency grazing in 1 year, and the same with the emergency. So as far as our non-emergency haying and grazing, non-emergency grazing can happen on all practices outside of the primary nesting season that we typically have in the general signups. So historically, we have not been able to graze CP25, the native prairie restoration. That is now being allowed. They also, the CP42s, the pollinator habitats that were going in for the last 3 to 4 years, those will be allowed to be grazed also. So that's something of a big change on this. One thing going on here is we are now going to be able to do it every other year on the ground. That had been changed previously, but a lot of people were never aware that we switched over. It used to be every 3 years on it. Now it has gone to grazing can be done every other year on the CRP. When we're doing this outside the primary nesting season with the majority of our producers, we're going to have to take a 25% payment reduction on the CRP. These last two bullets that I have in red here are some of the stuff that I just received yesterday. We're going to be allowed 120 calendar days of grazing. That does not have to be consecutive days on that 120 days, but we're going to be allowed to graze 120 days in a year, and the grazing season is going to be limited from March 1st to November 1st. Those are both things that came out from our national office, and we are under the assumption Iowa is going to stick with these as they are written. We cannot go any less restrictive than that, so the only thing we can do is tighten it up, and I do not believe that is going to be happening. We are also going to be allowed to do non-emergency grazing during the primary nesting season, PNS. But that does have some real factors coming into it, with the biggest one listing there that we have to do it at a 50% reduction in carrying capacity, or only being able to run about 50% of the cows on it for that primary nesting season. And remember, our primary nesting season's running from May 15th to August 1st. Hopefully during that time frame, we will have grass on our pastures going on. So we don't really need to be using that in drought situations. There is a 25% reduction going on with this one also. The biggest case where I could see somebody interested in doing this is if they're trying to reseed a pasture someplace else and they have no place else to go with the cows. This would be a great opportunity to try to do that. You're reseeding 40 acres, probably should be able to come in and do rent 80 acres of CRP to go ahead and run that on. Down here in the two red lines going on here, it is going to require an extensive grazing plan because we have to make sure to protect the wildlife during that primary nesting season. We have limited NRCS staff that can develop these plans. So if you are thinking about trying to do some grazing during this primary nesting season, please make sure to contact us many months ahead of time. And if this is even something you're thinking about and you have an application in for this, go ahead and tell us after it gets accepted into the CRP. Next one I want to talk about is non-emergency incidental grazing. This is one that hasn't been around and has been holding people back from putting CRP practices in on cropland fields. The non-emergency incidental grazing allows us to go ahead and graze our cropland fields with CRP practices in them, such as the grassed waterways, the contour buffer strips, the filter strips, many of those kind of things. And then we also have a limit on when we can do it. So we can do it when we're grazing those corn stalks in the fall. We can do it during the dormant season of a small grain. So if you have a wheat crop, I know we don't have much wheat or cereal rye out there, and you think you could graze it during the winter, you could go ahead and actually run out there and do some grazing during the winter. And we are also going to allow the CRP that's out there in situations where there's a small grain. After the small grain is harvested, if somebody puts a cover crop out there that they're planning to do a late season grazing on, to go ahead and do it at those times. So, as I just said, it has to be when the participant is attempting to graze the corn stalks. This pretty much all goes through the same thing again, the annual forage after the small grain crop aspect. So that is something different that has come in on this. We can go ahead and start doing those grazings. Here is the list of practices that are eligible for this non-emergency incidental grazing, CRP waterways, CRP contour buffer strips, the CRP filter strips, the CRP wetland restoration, such as the CP23s and the 23As, the CP37, the duck habitat CRP, and then some of our CRP safe acres are allowed to have that done. For the most part, I don't think many of them are going to be touched as the incidental part of this, because most of our CRP is in, or the safe CRP is in as general CRP practices. A couple of rules that they made sure to get out and printed to us yesterday that I'm going to go ahead and highlight here is that we're only going to be allowed 60 days of grazing in this incidental grazing of these stock fields that are going on. And then the last one's kind of a nice one. We're not going to have to work around that payment reduction. So these areas that are getting the higher dollar payments for these filtering practices and buffer practices, we don't have to pay back the 25% reduction for getting 60 days of grazing, which hasn't worked too good for, isn't too attractive. Next one I'm going to talk about is non-emergency gleaning grazing. And this is for gleaning the crop residue after the harvest of the crop that was on the field before the CRP is seeded down. So historically, we have said, with general CRP, the contract starts on October 1st. You're allowed to harvest the crop, but then that's the end of the use of that for the duration of the CRP, except for if you wanted to come in and do some grazing on it afterwards. Now we are going to allow those corn stalks to be gleaned ahead of seeding the CRP during the first year of the contract. And again, there's no payment reduction going on with that one either. Here is something new that's going on with this one, trying to help promote beginning farmers. As far as the non-emergency grazing, beginning farmers can conduct grazing activities in the non-emergency outside of the primary nesting season. That is a big change for us. One thing about this, that beginning farmer has to be on the CRP contract and have a share greater than 0% of the share. Other than that, it follows a lot of the same rules as we were just talking about with the non-emergency grazing outside of the primary nesting season. The first one I went over there. This next one talks about when the determination of the beginning farmer is based off of. It's the CCC 860, which is an FSA form, and it's for the year they want to graze. So I believe beginning farmers are allowed for the first 10 years that they are a farmer. So it's by each individual year. So somebody who is a beginning farmer will probably not be able to do the beginning farmer for all 10 years of a CRP contract. With this, there's no payment reduction going to these people, so it is helping to promote that livestock agriculture out there on some of this existing CRP ground. Again, we can graze it. Okay. One thing different on this one is we can actually graze it every year and do that 120-day limit during that March 1st to November 1st. Also with these, we're going to be requiring extensive grazing plan developed like we were with the stuff that's going to happen during the primary nesting season. So again, if you're looking into something like this and you're looking into it for a up and coming contract, it's better to get started asking earlier rather than later, because it is going to take us a little bit of time to help complete that grazing plan with you and get it developed so that it will maintain the objectives of the CRP and still allow you to maximize the grazing that we can utilize that ground for. Another thing that has happened here is we are now, when we used to have the term mid-contract management or MCM for doing the activities in the middle of the CRP contract to reset the plant life, grazing is now going to be allowed as a management activity going on MCM on the newer contracts, and it will be allowed on the old contracts also. If we do the management activity grazing, it has to be done outside of the primary nesting season. And we have to have that approved as a management plan, so that's something that's talked about up front. There is no payment reduction going on again with this, so we do not have to take a payment reduction to go in and do this management grazing. And it is only going to be allowed once per acre of the CRP contract. We can't come in and do our management activity grazing every other year of the contract kind of a thing. So it's going to be planned out there somewhere in the middle of the contract, typically around years 4 through 6, just for a heads up on when to try to plan for that kind of work. Again, this is something that planning ahead a little bit farther might help out, because we need to be planning the management activity when the contract is being developed before obligation by FSA. Now we're going to move into the non-emergency haying or harvesting of biomass on it. I'm just going to simply put it this way. It is available on all non-woody CRP practices. So anything that we're planting trees or shrubs on, we're not going to be allowed to do this. Basically, it's the same way with the grazing practices also. We're not going to be allowed to do those where we have woody plants going on also. On our haying, we are limited to once every 3 years on that. So we don't have the every other year like we do with the grazing. So when we go to the haying, we're allowed every 3 years, and 25% of it cannot be harvested to leave it protected cover for wildlife out there. And again, with this one, there's going to be the 25% payment reduction if we go in there and try to do that harvesting. It has to happen after the primary nesting season, so we're not going to be able to cut this hay until August 2nd. So we're not going to be getting the high quality hay that we really want. This kind of goes through and explains everything that I just went through with you as far as the payment reductions going on with it in the different situations and what's going on. I did make sure to put the extra note in here on the beginning, farmer grazing outside the PNS. I did note it has to be outside of the PNS. If we do the non-emergency grazing during the primary nesting season, that still needs the 25% reduction. So now we move into the next part, the emergency haying and grazing. That's something, we've had going on for a lot. Overall, I don't think there's a lot of change happening with it. We did increase the acres we can do it on. So as it says here, all practices outside of the primary nesting season. It is not allowed again on the tree practices. We kind of overstepped our bounds when I said all practices. And it is potentially not allowed on all the CP 38 safe contracts. Some of them do not allow them, and I'll get into that a little bit later. They're changed the ruling. Anybody from Southeast Iowa who went through that drought a couple of years ago knew that we had some things going on with the drought and trying to get emergency haying and grazing going on those years. They made sure to put this a little clearer for anybody, but it comes down to if any portion of the county is in a D2 drought, the drought monitor that's hosted by University of Nebraska in Lincoln, or if we have a 40% loss of forage production in the county. The 40% loss in forage is reported by the county committee through there. We also are allowed to do emergency haying in the LFP, the Livestock Forage Program approved counties. So if counties are declared eligible for livestock forage program assistance, then emergency haying is allowed at the practices listed here. The CP1s are introduced grasses, the CP2s are the native grasses. The 4Ds are another general CRP. CP8 is a waterway, 10 is a re-enrolled CRP. We don't have any 18Bs. The 21s are filter strips. The 23 is the CRP wetlands. 27 and 28 are some pothole ones up in north central Iowa. 37 is a duck habitat. 38, again, I talked about those a little bit, were the ones that were safe ones. And to tell you the truth, I can't even tell you what 39 and 41 are right now. Part about this, once that's designated, you can do it, but it has to happen after the primary nesting season. So we're not going to be able to do that until August 2nd again. Emergency grazing going on in the LFP counties. It can be done at 50% of the normal carrying capacity. That's just like we were talking earlier with the 25% payment reduction. I don't believe we have the payment reduction going on with the emergency grazing in these LFP counties. So this is we're going to have to try to work to get something done here for a plan for this, because it's going to be a lot quicker of a turnaround we're going to need once we get declared an emergency and people are starting to look for that. So hopefully we don't run into too many of these, but I'm sure we will. We'll have to make sure to work with you guys. Get in the FSA offices as soon as you can to start figuring it out instead of coming in the day before you need the forage. As far as emergencies, this is the website that you can actually go to from FSA, and it will actually show you what counties are. And as we look at this next map here, it's a map from last October that shows which counties were in the LFP, which counties were in the D2, and which counties were in both categories on those. So there is some of it that is going to have to be happening somewhere in the U.S. every year. This is a description of the emergency, going through them fairly quickly again. We really are probably going to have these out of slides fairly soon for people, or have them out available for people to see on paper copies someplace. So that brings up the subject of CREP, CRP. What we have for CREP in Iowa are the large constructed wetlands for denitrification of tile drain systems. That's mainly up in north central Iowa in the prairie pothole region where this is going on, which is only limited to very few counties. We're not going to be allowed, because when that CREP application went in, we did not ask to have permission to do haying or grazing on those, and they would be pretty hard ones to try to get done with that large wetland pool that's sitting out in the middle of them. So here's information on the haying and grazing of safe acres going on. These are the 4 safes that we currently have going on in Iowa. We have the early successional neotropical bird habitat one. That is not allowed. I believe that is all tree practices, and that's in the 4 counties in far northeast Iowa. Wenatchee, McKee, Clayton, and Fayette counties will be the 4 counties that one happens in. The Iowa Gaining Grounds for Wildlife is a popular safe one. That is allowed on some of it going on. That one is statewide. For the most part, that's going to be allowed on the ones that are more of the general CRP practices and not the continuous CRP. The next one I have listed here is the Grand River Safe Project, which is down there in the Prairie Chicken area in Ringgold County. And again, that's allowed on some, so you'll have to check with the local office again to see if it's happening. The Iowa Pheasant Recovery is not quite statewide. There's some counties that it's not covered with. And in that one, you're allowed to do it, but only on the nesting cover, not on the brood rearing habitat areas. And then the early successional quail habitat safe, it is not going to be allowed. That one is in the southern 3 tiers of counties across the state, and then it creeps up on both sides of the rivers a little way. Something else in here is that our no wildlife food plots will be eligible for haying and grazing. So something to keep into consideration. CRP food plots now need to be marked out as their own separate field. So if there's one out in the middle of something you're planning on haying or grazing, that is going to need to be fenced off to keep the livestock out of there. So going through this, we do need to come in and get some modification done to the conservation plan. Let's get some work done. That work can either be done by us at NRCS, or you can hire a TSP to do that work for you. We're going to have to make sure that we're not going to do any damage to the vegetative cover out there as we're writing that up. Again, I got the point here, cannot hay and graze the same acres in the same year. This is a new one that came up this year. We have setbacks of 20 feet from water bodies and streams. That is a significant change. It used to be 120 feet on that. And then we have supplemental feeding is not allowed of hay and grain and silage is not going to be allowed on the CRP. But however, we can go ahead and make sure to give them the minerals supplement that the cattle need to make sure to get through. The supplemental feeding is a bit of concern of mine. I don't know what the quality of some of these CRP are going to have as far as what the cows are needing during that August and September timeframe when we could be doing some of this. So we may want to be doing some forage testing on some of these before we try turning out there, because that's the last thing we need to do is go turn some cows out on some CRP to go get some reduced cost grazing, and then nobody breeds back because they didn't have enough nutrition to keep them in condition. Again, saying it again, we cannot affect the primary purpose or performance of the practice, so we need to make sure to keep that vegetation out there and keep the species out there that is intended to be planted in that CRP practice that was going on out there. And the heavy use locations are going to have to be watched and managed carefully so we don't create bare ground out there. So we may have to be moving some water tanks around if we're doing some temporary watering out there, moving the salt blocks around, somehow making sure that the cows are not loafing in the same spots on the CRP if they're going to be there for an extended period of time. So the next thing I want to talk through, now that I got through the big one there, is the CRP grassland information. I don't have a lot of information about that going on, but the sign up is going to be starting Monday in about 5 days, and it's going to be going through May 15th. Iowa NRCS and FSA used to have a rule that we required 30 days of rest between all grazing events. We have been talking and discussing this one, and we are looking at removing the requirement of having it for all grazing events, but making sure that we do have a 30-day rest period on the introduced grass legume ones and 45-day rest period on the native grass ones to allow those forbs and legumes to go ahead and get a chance to get some reseeding done out there. We had a lot of people, especially out in western Iowa in the Lusk Hills, when they signed up for it in the past, they signed up under the natives instead of the introduced species. And when we went out there and looked at it, the FSA asked them what they had out there, and they said, yeah, they had big blue stem and Indian grass and little blue stem, so they put it in as the natives. But then we went out there, and yes, they did have some, but the majority of it was introduced species. Some people were not allowed to enroll because they were going in under the wrong grass cover going on with that. That was one of the problems with us not going out there and taking a good look at it ahead of time. Again, on the CRP grassland, there is going to be some cost share available to help improve the pasture, maybe doing something with increasing the watering facilities, locations out there. when we're tied into some kind of a pressurized system, take an extra tank or so out there and putting in some additional fence if we want to try to improve the grazing system. And on these CRP grasslands, the contracts are going to be 10 or 15-year contracts going on for that. So that's going to have to be a consideration. This is a competitive sign-up, so not everybody's guaranteed to be getting into this. So we'll just have to see what happens. I did go ahead and put this. I don't know if you guys can read this very good, but it's what the rental rates are for that I have pulled out of information we have received. I will say this, I'm not sure. I see it says Potawatomi East on here is $69. I know that's the highest one. Potawatomi West is not on here. I'm not sure what Potawatomi West rental rate is going to be for this. On the flip side, I believe the lowest rental rate is up there in Wright County at $23. So there is a lot of variability in the rental rates on these CRP grassland rentals. And it can be counties right next to each other that have a significant change in them. So that is interesting, and it could possibly be a consideration for if you want to do it in one county or the other. So now I'm going to come on into the SHIP, the Soil Health and Income Protection Program. This is a pilot in Iowa, Minnesota, North Dakota, South Dakota, and Montana. So it's happening in just these 5 states. I didn't put it in here. There is a limit to 50,000 acres in this program. The sign-up period for this is going to start March 30th, so at the end of the month, and run through August 21st. As I said earlier, this is a little different. It's only a 3 to 5 year CRP contract. The participant gets to decide if they want 3, 4, or 5 years on it. The CRP payment is going to be at 50% of the rental payment. Now, this isn't tied into the grassland rental payments you just saw. This is tied into the cropland rental payments that we talked about. And then I start getting into stuff that I don't know how they're going to do this for sure. But the eligible acres are going to be the less productive 2/3 of the cropland acres as decided by the FSA farm number cropland acres. So they're going to look at the soils, and they're going to be looking at the National Plant Productivity Index, which runs very similar to Iowa's CSR2 as far as how that stuff's done. But then it's going to limit it to 2/3 of the cropland acres in there based on those soils. And I asked the question, what if you only have 1 or 2 soil types in there? What happens? We don't have an answer of that. But then of those 2/3 of the acres, 15% of those may be enrolled. So we don't know how many acres are even going to be allowed to be enrolled in this. This is something that if you are interested in, right now you're probably looking at, why would I want to do anything like that? But I would make sure to be in contact with your FSA and staying in touch to see if they have learned anything new about it. So for the SHIP, we have a pretty simple seeding requirement on it. It's going to require at least 1 grass and 1 forage legume. The seedings can be native or introduced species, so you can either come in and do some native species on it, or you can come in and do introduced species. For the majority of people, there's not going to be cost share for the establishment of the seeding. But here's the big attractive part of this. Haying and grazing are going to be allowed on it. But we still don't have any information yet what the take is as far as if it's going to be allowed during the primary nesting. We also don't know if it's going to have limited number of days of grazing or a limited number of cuttings of hay, just like with the cropland CRP we were just talking about earlier with 120 days, and you're only allowed to do 1 cutting of hay when you do emergency or non-emergency haying on cropland CRP. So that's the big question. Looking at this, that 50% rental payment's going to be somewhere, we're guessing $75 to $100 per acre for those people. It seems like our rental rate should be close to the 100% rental payments have been above 200 for most of the counties in Iowa. There is going to be some help here on the beginning farmers. They're going to get 75% of the CRP rental rate instead of the 50% going on this. They're going to have to be the contract holder again to get that. And they will get some limited cost share for the seeding establishment going in with this ship. Again, just giving you some of what we have heard. None of this has actually come out in true policy. It's still coming and looking at the regulations that have been written on it from the law that Congress enacted. That concludes my slides for this.
Thank you, Jeff. Yeah, I don't see any questions popping up yet, so we'll just go ahead and switch to Adam here.
I just want to compliment our team for putting together a really excellent series of webinars. I hope you like the format. It looks like we'll maybe doing more of this in the immediate future. With that, I'm going to introduce our final speaker tonight. Dr. Adam Janke is our Extension Wildlife Specialist. He's been doing that position for about the last 4 years. And we really appreciate the collaboration with Adam. Being able to emphasize that wildlife and profitable beef production can coexist. And so with that as an introduction, I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right, well, thank you for the opportunity to talk and participate in the webinar series. It's kind of like now for something completely different. I don't really do, of course, policy or anything like that. I'm a wildlife biologist, and specifically I'm a wildlife biologist that studies wildlife habitat. And so what I'm going to talk about is essentially what a wildlife biologist sees as opportunities for wildlife habitat and production operation. I think it does kind of follow nicely, or maybe it could have preceded some of the CRP things, because there's obviously a lot of overlap there, and I'd be happy to take questions on the sort of the wildlife side of some of those policies, and then of course Jeff and others would be much more equipped to answer questions about the specific policy things. So anyway, I'm going to talk about how wildlife use our pastures, how I think wildlife could fit into your production operation. And to do that, I'm going to talk almost exclusively about wildlife habitat and plants. And so, let me first tell you who I am, just so you have I guess there is a camera, but here's a mugshot for me, and everything I've done is all about wildlife and wildlife habitat. And there's all my degrees. So you can see I'm definitely not a livestock person, definitely not an agronomist. I'm none of those things. So I just study where birds live on farms. So I'm going to talk about wildlife habitat. And when we talk about wildlife habitat, you hear that word all the time. And I give talks to garden groups and to row crop farmers and to livestock producers. I talk about wildlife habitat. And I always want to make sure that we define what we mean when we say habitat. I think we throw the word around, and what's habitat to one critter is not habitat to another. And we want to try to get on the same page. So what we mean when we say wildlife habitat is the three things that we all need to survive, and then their configuration. So the three things that we all need to survive are food, water, and shelter. And then, of course, we need the food, water, and shelter to be arranged in a way that we can access. So that's, of course, livestock producers know that better than anybody, because you're dealing with the same thing in your production operation every day. And so I always make the point that if all the food were in Story County and all the water were in Boone County and all the shelter were in Polk County, we wouldn't have any wildlife anyway. We shouldn't expect that to be any different than on our farm. So I'm going to go through each one of these and where we find these specifically in grassland systems in Iowa. And so first, the food. So for wildlife, when it comes to food, lots of stuff is food. Wildlife themselves are food. The main types of food that we find in pasture systems are, of course, the herbaceous material, just like the livestock are eating. Also, the nectar and seeds that are produced, seeds and fruits that are produced by plants. And then also all of the other things that live on the plants out there, including primarily insects. So a lot of the considerations that we have for managing grasslands for wildlife, we think a lot about grassland breeding birds, and that's certainly reflected in CRP policy, like we just heard. And a lot of what happens with grassland breeding birds is driven by insect populations. And then, of course, there's insect populations as well that we're concerned about, and they eat nectar and so on and so forth. So lots of stuff is food, but generally we think about plants and insects. As for shelter, lots of stuff is also shelter. It can be the configuration or the structure of the vegetation. It can also be special modifying elements like woody vegetation. So here, this picture on the bottom just shows shelter if you're a baby, say northern bobwhite, and you're trying to find insects and you're no bigger than a ping pong ball, then you're going to take shelter underneath that stand of ragweed. If you're mature, say northern bobwhite or a ringneck pheasant or something, in the dead of winter, then you may not find shelter in a stand of ragweed, but rather find shelter in a shrub thicket like that or something. So shelter takes many different varieties on our farms and in our pastures. But of course, it's an important consideration. I didn't talk about water because I think that's pretty intuitive. And in fact, most of the wildlife that we manage in Iowa don't really seek out surface water sources. Most of them, unless they're aquatic organisms, most of them actually find it in their food or find it in puddles and dew. And it's really just not a limiting factor in Iowa's pasture system. But space can be a big factor. And space, this is the last point for the wildlife habitat configuration, is to consider area constraints. Sometimes we have organisms that respond well to things that are in that picture up there in the top. That's a CRP practice on probably, I don't know, fewer than 40 acres probably, in a sea of row crop production in north central Iowa. That's pretty good habitat for a thing like monarch butterfly or a ringneck pheasant or something like that. But a greater prairie chicken would look at that and laugh, because a greater prairie chicken needs thousands of acres of grass, something more like the picture down at the bottom where grass goes in every direction. And so we do have species of wildlife that we manage differently around the state, considering the space component, just because they have what we call area requirements. Either they need a lot of area or they need things in some certain configuration. So that's a point that I always have in the back of my mind when I'm doing education on wildlife habitat, is to make that point for organisms. So if we imagine that those four elements comprise what makes up wildlife habitat, then we can start to look to our farms to try to find the areas where we may find habitat for different organisms. And so here I've got a schematic of a grassland system that ranges in disturbance levels. And this schematic can help us find variability in the structure and composition of the vegetation that wildlife may be responding to. So things that a wildlife biologist looks at in a grassland environment include things like the vegetation height. And so here, of course, you can see variation from maybe what's a season-long continuous grazing on the left to something that isn't ever touched on the right. So you can imagine sort of a gradient of disturbance. We also look for things like bare ground. Now, bare ground on its own, like a trampled area, or like you'd see around maybe a feeding area, isn't necessarily a good element of wildlife habitat. But bare ground interspersed with vegetation, like depicted here on this slide, can be really critical for species like ground-dwelling birds, like northern bobwhites and ringneck pheasants. We also look at things like vegetation density. So that's sort of the opposite of bare ground, where you could maybe have really dense clumps of vegetation. In some species of wildlife, like the Hinslow sparrow, a grassland breeding bird, or even the dick sisel, also a grassland and shrubland breeding bird, like to find areas that have really dense vegetation because they actually string their nests up in the vegetation itself and need a lot of structure there to support their nests. Another really important factor for wildlife diversity in our graze systems is vegetation diversity. Or different types of flowering plants or fruit or seed producing plants are going to invite more diversity of insects and also more diversity of wildlife. And then the last consideration when we think about where we find wildlife habitat within our graze systems, we can think about what I just call special modifiers. And that's two main factors. Is we can see really different assemblages of wildlife in and around wetlands in pastures or in grassland environments, or in areas with shrubs. And so an example, of course, with wetlands may be, say, ducks or shorebirds or a bunch of different species of amphibians will take advantage of wet areas in our pasture that, of course, wouldn't be found in the drier parts. And then the shrubs, of course, can be important habitat for things during the winter, or some species of birds that prefer a more woody stand of grass or early successional vegetation. So what I'm going to show you now is a series. So we're going to use this gradient again to try to explore where we find wildlife across these different vegetation types. And so what I'm going to show you is just a couple of slides that along the bottom is the range where we observe these organisms, primarily nesting. I'll tell you if we're not talking about nesting, but this slide here is common grassland nesting birds in Iowa. And the width of their bar just shows their preferences or their affiliations for the type of vegetation characteristics that I just went through before: bare ground, vegetation height, vegetation density, and plant diversity in their nesting preferences. And so you can see, well, first of all, lots of different species of wildlife depend on our grasslands for nesting habitat throughout Iowa. These are definitely the most common ones that we share our farms with. And you can see a few things. One, we have organisms that occupy this whole gradient. Of course, we shouldn't be surprised to find that, because all of these different types of grasslands were once really common on Iowa's tallgrass prairie landscape. We also find that there's relatively more species of grassland nesting birds adapted to the sweet spot in the middle. This is the same sort of Goldilocks principle that we can learn from a lot of things in ecology, and that is that intermediate levels of disturbances tend to create the most diversity. And where we have the most diversity, in this case right in the middle, is where we have the most bird diversity as well. And so lots of species of birds overlap in this area where it's sort of a transition from really dense rank vegetation that only a few species, the Henslow sparrow and the northern heron, are like, and very few species like the really short grass that we see in moat systems or continuously grazed systems. So that's grassland breeding birds. Folks are often interested in game birds, and this is a species, these are groups of birds that I study, so I think about them a lot. First, the picture up in the upper left-hand corner, that's a handful of freshly hatched northern bobwhite chicks. You can see how small they are and how small it is for a bird like that to have to feed on its own in grassland environments within 24 hours of coming out of the egg. And so they, of course, their broods are found in those areas that have a lot of bare ground interspersed among the vegetation, because that bare ground gives them the place that they can forage on insects and have overhead cover to protect them from predators. And then, of course, their moms and dads put nests in sort of intermediate levels of grass. Pheasants will nest in just about anything. Anything that's dense and has litter from last year's growth. And that nesting bar is covered up, at least on our screen, by the camera, but it goes all the way over to the extreme. And then broods, just like bobwhites, follow a similar pattern of preferring to be in areas with a lot of forbs. And then wild turkeys, they'll, of course, strut out in the open, and then they'll also raise their brood grasslands. Most of their nesting goes on in the forest. So. Other stuff that we're interested in, white-tailed deer, of course, use grassland environments a lot. They can forage, particularly on just any broadleaf plants in our grassland environments. And then, of course, they use them a lot for fawning cover. White-tailed deer really like to have their young in grassland environments, and so they use those sort of intermediate density areas to have their young. And then, of course, during the winter time, sometimes they'll use rank vegetation. Barn owls are a pretty cool species of bird that we find relatively common in areas with a lot of pasture in southern Iowa. I guess I shouldn't say relatively common, but we find them in areas with a lot of pasture in southern Iowa. And they forage out over pastures that are grazed. And then monarch butterflies will be found anywhere where we have flowering plants, because, of course, they rely on nectar and milkweeds, and that's where we find them in those sort of intermediate levels of disturbance. So my last thing, I'm still on this topic of what is wildlife habitat? What's a wildlife biologist think about when they're assessing a pasture for providing wildlife habitat? And the last thing I wanted to mention is, and I've been hinting at this all along, is that there's also seasonal variation in how wildlife use our grassland environments in Iowa. And so here is just sort of a arbitrary line to make the point. So don't use this to inform exactly when wildlife are having, or when our birds are hatching their nests. But we know from the NRCS talk that we just heard, you know, the peak nesting is in that May to August period in the state. And this line sort of just reflects that the vast majority of all of our bird nests have hatched come August, and the majority of that hatching and fledging is occurring in the July window. And then that other picture is that some of these species use our pastures during the summertime, and they take off and they actually use pastures in South America during the wintertime. So many of the species that we'll share our farms with here in a few weeks or in a few months are today in South and Central America on their way migrating back up to our farms. There's other species, so we manage for those species differently, because all we have to do is think about their nests and raising their young. We manage for species that stay here and endure our winters with us in a different way. That's depicted here with the life cycle of the northern bobwhite, where they, of course, like to breed and raise their young in grassland environments, but during the wintertime, they prefer to be out on the forest edges and in shrubbier environments. And so when it comes to managing wildlife on our farms, we have to remember that things change throughout the season. And for a species that's a resident bird, like the northern bobwhite, we've got to think about providing their habitat elements throughout their entire life cycle, rather than just that one period like we do with many birds. Okay, so that was my effort to define wildlife habitat and get us all on the same page. Now what I'm going to do for the rest of my time here is just sort of walk you through where I see the opportunity areas for wildlife habitat in any production operation in Iowa, I suppose, depending on the size and options. So this, I kind of look at this as like sort of a buffet of options, like things that you could do that research shows improves grassland systems, pasture systems for wildlife habitat. So here I just start with a conventional pasture configuration. I don't know how big this thing is, but imagine it's a couple hundred acres. And this is what it looks like. One fence around the outside and say continuous season-long grazing. The best thing that you could do for wildlife in a continuously grazed pasture system is to introduce rotational grazing. Rotational grazing does a lot of good for wildlife because it introduces diversity back into the pasture. So rather than having homogeneous treatment of the forage across the whole pasture, we try to introduce this variability by having periods of rest and periods of grazing. And so there's been lots of research, really nice research out of Wisconsin that showed that many of our declining grassland breeding birds take advantage of these rotational grazing paddocks. And you remember back to that graphic that I showed that showed the gradient of preferences for vegetation height and vegetation density. We can imagine that through periods of rest in these different paddocks, those different paddocks would fit into that gradient. So we'd have really tall stuff and the stuff that we haven't hit this season, or stuff that we hit 30 days ago. And then we'd have really short stuff and the things that we just took the cows off yesterday. So it would introduce all that diversity back into the system. It's good for the grass, it's good for the ground, and it's good for birds. So rotational grazing can do a lot of good for wildlife if it fits within your production operation. Another thing is that we've talked about this primary nesting season as being from May to August. The peak nesting, particularly in terms of nest construction and raising young, is occurring in May and June in Iowa's grasslands. And so providing a refuge could be a really good way to provide good wildlife habitat in your pasture as well. And by refuge, we just mean you can be in there early in the year, but come May 1st or May 15th, well, probably May 1st, pull everything out and leave that paddock. Maybe it's in your rotation, but you don't come back to it until June. That can do a lot of good for providing relatively dense cover for grassland breeding birds during that most sensitive period in their life cycle. So that's also coming from that research in Wisconsin that says if you can provide a refuge, you can do a lot of good for breeding birds. The next one is in this top right corner, and that's stockpiling. Stockpiling in a paddock or in a specific area in the farm, I think, creates another opportunity to introduce diversity back out into the pasture. And so here, where you allow for the vegetation to grow late in the growing season, this is going to provide, if it has flowering plants in the pasture, as most do, it could provide a late season nectar resource for migrating monarch butterflies and other late season insects and butterflies that are on the landscape during the late summer and fall. So that can provide a really good resource that can sometimes be limiting. It can also provide a good seed source or structure vegetation for migratory grassland breeding birds, birds that have bred further north and are on their way to those South American wintering grounds during the late summer and fall. And then when you need the forage, you go in there after all those birds are gone, and take advantage of the forage there. So stockpiling is a way to create more diversity in your system that also is good for it. The next opportunity area for diversifying grazing system that would be good for wildlife is to have introduced native grasses back into the system, and specifically to use them as a summer pasture. Now, again, I told you that I don't claim to be a forage specialist or anything like that, so I'd rely on Rebecca and others to share with you the science behind this. But essentially what we know are traditional forage grasses, and this is a figure from Iowa NRCS, our traditional forage grasses, our cool season grasses, our traditional native grasses that wildlife biologists spend most of our time working with and thinking about, are warm season grasses. They obviously, as the name implies, have different growth patterns. And some folks have been successful in using converting areas on their farm into native grass pastures to help overcome things like a summer forage slump. If the native pastures are managed in a way that would be sort of like that refuge, where the disturbances or the grazing isn't introduced until the middle of the summer, when that forage is peaking in its quality and the cool season grasses start to decline, then that's an opportunity that we could have some both benefits to the grazing operations and also potentially some additional nesting cover. And then also, of course, there's value in sort of managing native vegetation back out onto our landscape, or managing native pasture in a way that promotes those plants. So that's another option for wildlife habitat. Another thing is to use natural thermal refuges for shade and wind. This is essentially just reminding you of the value of the trees that are in your pastures, or windbreaks that are planted around the outside or around the homestead. These things can be really important in diversifying the types of organisms that can use grassland environments. So in Iowa, of course, at the time of European settlement, we would have had 10% or so of Iowa's land area was in sort of an open oak savanna transitional area between tallgrass prairie and forested environments. And so we have many species of wildlife like the eastern bluebird, red-headed woodpecker, and some others that are uniquely adapted to savanna ecosystems. So having big open-grown oak trees in your pasture can both introduce thermal refuges for hot July days for the herd, and it can also provide important wildlife habitat for some of those birds that I mentioned, bats and other organisms. So I always like to just advocate for natural thermal refuges, and also a consideration for wind. If you have consistent areas with drift or like snow drift or wind pressure, using natural features can be good for wildlife and can also be good for the farm. And then the last consideration, if I was given this pasture to work on, the last thing, I have this little stream depicted in the bottom right corner, and that is just protect surface water. There's lots of ways to do that. Of course, NRCS has lots of programs to help you do that. But as a general rule, we like to keep livestock out of surface water if we can, for issues with E. coli and otherwise. But if that's the watering source, that's fine. Then you just want to control the access, or make the access in a way that minimizes, one, the potential for introduction of manure into the stream itself, and then also to prevent erosion to the extent possible. And so we just want to remember that that's also a part of our production operation in protecting surface waters, particularly for downstream neighbors and downstream water quality can be another important function. So that's all I prepared for today. I want to just sort of remind you of the summary. I call these opportunity areas because I always try to emphasize where I think there's these opportunities for benefiting both the producer and wildlife and other organisms that we share our farms with. So just to recap those here: rotational grazing, refuges, stockpiling or deferred rotations, native warm season forages, natural shade and wind, and protecting our surface. That's sort of my wrap-up slide. I don't think I have anything else. Thank you for your time and interest in the topic, and I think we'll take questions.
All right, thank you, Adam. On the slide now, you should see all of your regional field specialists as well as my contact information as an individual on campus. Let us know if you enjoyed the webinar format. If you want to see more programs presented online where you can watch from home, we need that feedback in order to get those to you. So reach out to your field specialist, tell them what you thought, tell them what topics we need to cover instead of what we chose to cover in these 4-part series we did here.